Good morning, Lit 8 students. I'm so sorry that we couldn't meet because of the snow and I miss all your beautiful faces. But I just wanted to go over a few of the concepts from this chapter with you guys from chapter 9, Theme and Worldview. Most of you, I think, are really good by now at identifying things like the plot and the characters and the setting, the conflict. We've talked about all those terms and they're pretty easy to grasp. You get that the plot is what happens and how it happens. You get that the setting is where and when, and you get that the characters are the who. But the theme part, the why, unless you're reading an Aesop's fable where it comes out and says, and the lesson that you should learn from this story is don't be vain or don't be arrogant or be suspicious of foxes or whatever. Unless an author comes out and just directly tells you what the reason they're writing their story is, theme can be tricky to identify. And so the theme, why, is a little bit of maybe a misleading word. I don't know that writers sit down and say, I'm going to write a story. And the reason why I'm going to write the story is because I want to teach people to rob banks or love God, or that the end does not justify the means or whatever. Some writers do sit down with a certain intent in mind and they write a story to teach a point. So when Christina Rossetti wrote the poem Symbols, she clearly had a message in mind that she wanted to convey to the readers about, or Thomas Hardy and the Convergence of the Twain. He clearly had a message about the arrogance of man and the fact that in his worldview, fate was a force that was greater and more powerful than anything man could create. And so the arrogance and pride of man was symbolized by the Titanic, and fate and nature's power was symbolized by the iceberg. And when they meet, iceberg wins. And therefore fate and nature win over anything that man intends or designs. And that reflects Thomas Hardy's worldview. All right, so worldview is this big word that you may hear a lot in church but may not understand. And a worldview is just the way we look at the world. Makes sense, right? Worldview. The problem is a lot of us don't even really stop and think about what our own worldview is, or that someone else's worldview might be very different than ours. So we're going to assume baseline here that because we have a Christian worldview, and that means things like we believe in God. Thomas Hardy didn't believe in God. He believed in fate. So that iceberg for him didn't represent the power of God. It represented a natural force of fate. We believe in God. We believe in sin. We believe that people are going to sin and that they can't ever be perfect on their own. We believe that God is not only we believe that God is all powerful and that he is just and that he is good, and that there's a plan for the universe, that there's a pattern to it, that there are things that make sense. We believe that Jesus will return, that ultimately things will be restored. Now, someone else might have a very different worldview. They might believe something like there is no God, but humans have the ability to perfect themselves. And so when they write a story, they might portray people able to actually improve and perfect themselves on their own power, where a Christian writer would say, no, people are never going to be perfect. We will all sin and fall short of the glory of God. Or you might have a person who believes in God or gods, but believes that those gods are malevolent and evil and unloving. And so they would portray the world as this place where things are out to get you and you can't possibly prevail against these forces, that there's not justice. Or you might have someone who has a worldview that doesn't believe in God and says, you know what? Do whatever you want, right? If you're strong enough and powerful enough to do it, take it. Or, yeah, there are things that are wrong, like murder or robbing banks, but there are times when those things are totally okay. There might be reasons that those things would be justified, and they might show a story in which a character or characters do immoral acts, things that we would consider immoral acts, and the narrative of that story attempts to justify those immoral actions. So it's super important for just us as people to recognize that when we read, and probably for more of you more when you watch movies and TV shows, that those shows have worldviews. And some of them not only have worldviews, they have agendas. They are trying to convince you to portray something about the morality of the world, about the nature of the world, about the nature of humans, about the nature of God. And for most of us, a lot of what we read and see does not have a biblical, godly worldview. And so if we don't recognize that those things are coming, I've got this weird hair sticking up. Sorry, it's distracting me. if we don't recognize that something's coming from a worldview that isn't godly, then we may find ourselves influenced by it without realizing that we're being influenced by that. So connected to that is that idea of theme. What is the overarching idea of a story, of a movie, of a book, of a poem, of a play? What worldview does it reflect, and what lesson does it seem to offer about life? So this idea of theme will help you when you're writing literary essays from now or in college or wherever. It's a good thing to know how to do, but more importantly, it may be the most crucial skill that I can give you in this class, not so much for your writing, but for your living, that you're able to recognize that there are underlying philosophies and concepts behind everything you encounter. And the better you get at identifying them, the less likely you will be to be duped into subconsciously accepting beliefs that are not part of what you want to be living by. All right, so I had you guys think on Monday about why we read, and we didn't get a chance to go over those posters. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit on Monday. But let me tell you why I like to read. Hey, there's Will. Wave, Will. And then get out of my camera. That's kind of creepy. All right, so why do I read? I read because I love it. I enjoy it. I get wrapped up in it, and it passes time for me. But I don't read just anything. I don't want to read something that doesn't offer me something. So what I look for to read are things that are well written, are rich, have well-developed characters, have interesting plots, are exposing me maybe to ideas or worlds that I'm not familiar with, or reflecting on the world that I am familiar with in a way that makes me see it more clearly, more profoundly, or in a different way. So there's lots of life that I haven't lived. I've never lived in 19th century England. I've never lived in first century Israel. I've never lived in New York City. I've never lived in Paris. I've never been African American. I've never been Muslim. There's all kinds of experiences that I can't ever have and probably never will have. But if I read a book, I can gain a perspective on those experiences of what life might have been like for people in the past, about what life is like for people now who are different than me. And that can create in me empathy. It can create in me interest. I know for me too, a lot of times sometimes history used to seem really dry and boring to me, but if I would read a book set in a time period and I became interested in those characters and their lives, then suddenly that part of the history came alive for me. So it helps me understand the world in a better way. Sometimes I'm reading a book just because I love it, just because I enjoy it. Harry Potter is something that I think you guys know. Not everybody's into it, but for years, like since the first book came out and before it was big, I've been enthralled with those stories because she creates this world that just sucks you in. But in the process of that, I've certainly identified themes in those stories. Themes like courage and loyalty are some of the most important character traits. Themes like arrogance will always be destructive.